So good morning, everyone, and welcome to WRIT 1003. Today, our topic is going to be designing team presentations. I have taken into account the fact that you will be recording your presentations, but I've also included a section about live presentations because I think it's important that you get tips and hints about managing nerves and that kinds of thing when you're doing live presentations. So I'm going to share my screen. If at any point you have questions, please let me know. While I have the slideshow on, it can be difficult to see chat, but we'll try. So this is designing team presentations. I invariably find that when teams present together, especially when they do it live, they congratulate themselves when they're done because most of them do an excellent job. So the requirements for this particular aspect of the team project, you have to record as an MP4 file. There should be one video file per team, but because of the size, what I would like you to do is submit a link in a Word or a PDF file on eClass. So don't try to upload the whole thing, because large files take space. You only have 2 gigs, and I don't want you spending all that time. I do not want you to spend all that time uploading to eClass because it can be very slow. The length of your presentations, know that I'm not going to take grades off if you go slightly over time. What you're trying to do, though, is ensure that each team member has roughly 3 minutes to speak, plus the entire team has 3 minutes extra for the introduction and conclusion. So you're striving for balance. Every team member must participate somehow. That is part of the reason you're recording these. As an example of the timing, if you have 3 team members, you would have 9 minutes plus an additional 3 minutes for 12 minutes. If you have 4 team members, multiply by 3, you come up with 12, add 3 is 15. Please note that to prevent one person from dominating the presentation, any individual team member who goes over 5 minutes in their part of the recording will lose a full grade. The team will not suffer for that individual. These are to be played on April 5th in your tutorials, and each team will have a live short Q&A session after their presentation has been played. A word about this, some teams have asked me about extensions. Yes, the usual 1-week extension is available to teams. The team will have to balance out those who want to finish with those who want the extension. If you are in a situation like this yourself, and you are one of the team members who wants to finish on April 5th, then all you have to do is record your part of the presentation to make sure it's there, to work with the team on the entire presentation, and then to do a check later on once everybody has recorded their parts to make sure the presentation as a whole is coherent and looks like a team did it rather than 3 to 5 individuals. So you can work with extensions if need be. You do need to use visual aids. I would point you to PowerPoint because it's free and it's available to all students. Please note that no student in this class will be forced to purchase software or to download software that they don't really want. I really would point you towards the free software that York offers, in part because it is pretty ubiquitous throughout industry. And so it's a good thing to learn how to use them, even if you have other required programs. Each team member, as I said, must participate and record roughly 3 minutes of the presentation. I want to make an important note here Each individual has the choice of whether to keep a camera on or to turn the camera off. So if you want your face to appear, turn your camera on. If you don't, turn it off. No grades are involved in whether you decide to record on camera or not. Other requirements: the team has to include a title slide at the beginning and a reference slide or a series of reference slides at the end. Are there any questions about those requirements? I think they're pretty straightforward. And so, roughly speaking, here's an overall look at what most presentations consist of. It's like any other piece of writing. It needs a beginning, it needs a middle, and it needs a clear ending. With presentations, you always have to think of who you're presenting for. Your title slide is important because it gives us information we need about your topic at a glance, also about team members, possibly how to contact you. You will need a beginning. In this case, it consists of an introduction. As always, you introduce your topic. This can also be a good place to introduce the individual team members. Your middle is the part you really have to work to design, because it's got to be divided into appropriate parts that hang in with your purpose or objective. An important thing to remember about the middle: you need to show us, not just tell us. We need evidence. That's been a theme right throughout this course. We need to see the evidence on the screen. Use visuals, use quotes, use statistics, use all the forms of evidence that you've learned to use. Your ending is your conclusions and/or your recommendations. So that is your overall findings. So each part of the middle, you can have smaller conclusions in there. Your conclusions at the end should be overall, and you should include recommendations, which are, of course, call for action. The reference slides, you need to include everything, every source of information you used, whether it's in person, online, by email. And finally, though I don't really talk about it, presentations can also have an acknowledgement section. So if someone really helped you out with your presentation, granted you an interview, for example, when you didn't expect it, guided you, or gave helpful suggestions about your presentation, this could be friends, family members, instructors, etc., etc. It is nice to thank them in an acknowledgement section at the end. And I want to go into detail about each section now. Here is a title slide that I made up for the fun of it. It's based on a project that I had teams do several years ago, but it's not from any particular team presentation. You'll notice the title is prominent and short. It's also active. It's got that creating verb in there. You can tell at a glance what the topic is. The image matches, and this is one that, this is a photograph that one of the students took for a project that I borrowed. It's from Toronto, TTC bus. It echoes the theme. You will also notice the York logo on here. It is common in business practice to put the business logo up there. Your team name should be prominent and stand out in some way. And your team members shall be listed. Bonus points for anyone who can identify the book I took the team members from. To the person who just wrote about being unable to attend on the 5th, we can speak after class. There are alternatives, obviously, to you being present. Bonus points for anyone who can identify the book that Anne Shirley Gilbert Blythe, the Marilla Cuthbert came from. Anyone? Oh dear, oh well. Yeah, the series that was based on the book was Anne with an E. Thank you for that, Ruby. And yes, absolutely, the book itself was Anne of Green Gables. Please note also that I dated my slide April 5th, 2022. That can be important, especially if you are sending your slides to the company you presented to, or the client you presented to, or to management at your own company. I want to talk about some strategies for beginning. Obviously, you have to introduce your team. Equally, obviously, you have to introduce your problem, question, or situation. I want to say a word about design here. Generally speaking, the entire team should agree on the purpose or the objective that you're going to put at the end of your introduction or the beginning of it on screen. But when you design a presentation, there is a tendency for individuals or teams to spend far too much time on the introduction, designing the introduction, and to neglect the middle. So to all of you, as your design strategy, put your purpose or objective on a slide, go on to design the middle and the ending, and then come back to the introduction and design it last. Having done that, here's the content you need to include. You need to explain the context, the background information, the problem, the situation, etc., that leads to your objective or your purpose or your research question. You also need to tell us why your question is important. In other words, you have to assume your audience knows nothing about your project, and you have to set it up for us. If you don't tell us, we don't know. You can set us up with, for example, statistics, the commuter problem, for instance. You could talk here about X number of York University students commute to York each year, but only X% attend on-campus events. And so you would cite the source for both of them, but you're clearly setting up your research question or problem here. As an opening for the beginning, you can start with the title slide and have one of your team members say, "Good morning, I'm," putting my own name in here, "Andrea from Team WRIT 1003, and our team is studying how to create collegiality among commuting students at York University." We would then move to the next slide where there would be information about the number of first-year students who commute and the number of students who attend on-campus events. When it comes to stating the purpose, this must be very clear in all presentations, to the point where your objective, your research question, or your purpose, I recommend you put it by itself on a slide. You are required to have an objective, a purpose, or a question. And in this case, WRIT 1003's purpose was to recommend innovative methods to create a spirit of collegiality amongst first-year students who commute to York University. That would be on a slide by itself after the team has set up the rationale for the project. So put it on a slide by itself. Here's a tip for those of you designing presentations. Never ever place important information on the bottom quarter of the screen, because when we read slides, we read top down. And getting to the bottom of the slide, our attention may have strayed, or we don't place as much importance on that bottom quarter. It's also a case that various types of technology miss out the bottom part of the screen. The middle section, this is the part you really have to design, just like your report. And that's why you write the report first, so you have all the information you need to design the presentation. So you have to design the middle into logical sections, just like your report. You have to amalgamate the team's research to your best advantage. So instead of designing the presentation simply by, say, Samantha did the research into this aspect of commuting, sorry, change the names here. Anne researched one aspect of commuting, and then Marilla guided the team and contributed herself. So she did a second part and Gilbert did a third part. You may find to create a coherent presentation, you need people to amalgamate their research and to share it to create a more coherent flow. If that's the case, it's fine. You can always put a page in your report telling us who researched what. So in the case of commuters, first part might be, why don't commuters attend campus events? The second one might be, what resources are available to commuters? And the third section might be solutions. Designing logical titles for that section and showing us what those solutions would be and how they match the reasons why commuters aren't attending campus events. You do need to cite all your sources on the slides, and this is the way, the example of Ella Montgomery in the bottom right, that I do it. You don't need the bullet mark. I use right justification. I use much smaller type than the rest of the slide. So you can actually put such citations into your points themselves if you need to, or you can put them at the bottom of the screen. Now, one of the things that you're going to find when it comes to designing a presentation is, generally speaking, what you design is much longer than the time limit. That's quite common because we're all afraid of not filling up the time. Well, let me tell you, with the amount of research that you've done, it's probably more a case of deciding what you can present in the time that you're given. And here is where the design work really comes in. If you have a number of findings, you have to choose which the most important ones are. And you can often do that by looking at their impact. You have to prioritize. Instead of giving us a laundry list of 10 points that we're not going to remember, you're much better to give us maybe 3 or 4 of your most important findings, the ones that come at the top of your list and that are essential. Another way to decide is to look at the immediate impact of each of your findings or recommendations and decide by the impact that they have and the higher level meaning or the significance they have for the field. If you're having difficulty cutting down, that's a good way to do it. You design the rest of the presentation around these unique points, and you simply tell us these are the most important findings. There are more contained in our report. Above all, what you have to think about when you design a report or a presentation is, what's the story you're trying to tell us? What's the narrative through line? So from beginning through the middle to the ending, especially the ending, what story comes out of the findings you gained or you obtained and the impact they have? Does your middle show us the evidence we need to make those conclusions, those recommendations acceptable? And does your opening match that ending? Are you consistent throughout? So think about your presentation as a story that you're designing to show findings, impact, and those are the ending. The rest of the presentation has to lead to that. Once again, designing presentations means making choices. Once again, you have done, in many cases, so much research and you have so little time to present. Those of you who are thinking after you graduate of going on to graduate studies will find when you go to conferences and such, You do all this research, you write a 20-page paper, and you are then given 20 minutes to present. There is no possible way. 20 pages would probably take you a minimum of an hour to present. And in most fields, you don't simply read a paper, you carefully craft a presentation. It may be extemporaneously delivered, or it may be read. The point is, invariably, you have to cut down, and it's agonizing sometimes, you have to cut down to fit the time, or the chair of your panel will simply cut you off. So choices have to be made. Other strategies to use. Look at the evidence that you have collected. Where do you find the strongest evidence? Or is there a way to organize your evidence so that one slide can show a great deal of it without overwhelming the audience? So for example, the survey that was just done would lend itself very nicely to a series of graphs. Obviously, the team can't put all the graphs onto one slide, and it's going to take them too much time to show the results for every single question. So they're going to have to pick and choose which are the most important findings that they obtained out of that survey, and how can they visually represent those, and how can they do it swiftly? Secondly, you present only the most relevant results, not all. So you may end up presenting examples and saying, here are our top or our most relevant results. Please see our report for the rest. You may want to choose what I call the top results or findings. That is the most interesting aspect of the research findings that you obtained. Now, when you design presentations, I'm looking at my own slides here. They're all text. When I present for conferences, the interesting thing is that my slides are mostly visual. So one of the things that you have to get used to when you are presenting is thinking visually, which you had a chance to do in your video. You had a chance to analyze other people's visuals, and you also have the chance to design a flow of visuals of your choosing. When you design presentations, relevant visuals become incredibly important. This is the example that I use. I have seen, not this particular example, I made it up, but multiple examples, and many of them over the years, that follow these lines. Here's what not to do, and you can see why. Geographic locations of the continents of the world: North America, north of South America, Australia, Antarctic, west of Europe and Asia. Then we go on to South America. It's south of North America and the Arctic. It's west of Europe and Asia. It's north of the Antarctic. By the time I get to Europe, you can see my point. I can show this much more easily by doing this. Images help you. Images convey information swiftly to your audiences if they're designed well. So images really can be worth 1,000 words. You don't have 1,000 words to spare. Keep this in mind. I'll be going into this more in a while. Conclusions and recommendations. Once more, I would emphasize conclusions are your research findings. So if you were doing the project about commuting students, your conclusion based on evidence, you might have done surveys, you might have looked at York, you might have found this information online. Your conclusion based on your research, which you've shown us in the middle of your presentation, is that students are unaware of available resources. That is a statement that you backed up by evidence that you've shown us in the middle. Your recommendation should be along the lines of York University should, and this is your call for action, should do something to make students better aware of the available resources. Another conclusion might be that students are unaware of campus events. You would then make a call for action to York University to recommend some kind of solution to that. But you don't end there. You go back to your purpose and your objective, and you look at it, and you look at the larger impact or significance of your work. Bluntly, when you're doing presentations for academics, this is where you go from a B to a B plus, or an A to an A plus, or an A minus to an A. It is not stopping with those smaller conclusions and actions, but looking at the larger impact or significance. Team WRIT 1003 believes that if York University takes these actions, more first-year students who commute would make friends and become more engaged in the York community. Making a statement such as that may not seem especially important if you're looking at commuting students at York University. It recalls to mind, however, a student of mine from New York University who was working on figuring out what causes Alzheimer's disease and looking for potential medical means of halting or improving it. And it just so happened that the project he was working on made a new discovery about that. It was incredibly innovative. I mean, this was a fourth-year student, obviously working with more experienced people, but the team's findings were highly impactful. Imagine if he had just left smaller conclusions based on his finding and not done a statement about the larger impact or significance. That larger impact and significance, of course, would have been the impact on people with Alzheimer's and the improvement that this discovery based on sound research could make. So you see the importance in other fields through this the importance on the field in this last statement. Ending your team presentation, whether it's recorded or live, the last speaker should always, always, always thank the audience for listening. If you're doing an individual presentation, by the way, this is something you should always do at the end of a presentation. Do not end with, and that's about it, which I've heard far, far too often. You need a strong ending. Saying something along the lines of, that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening. Signals the audience that you're done and they will applaud. If you don't say thank you, then the audience is left, and I have seen this too before, uncertain about whether you're finished or not, and you don't get that burst of applause and appreciation because they just don't know. So the last speaker, even in a recorded presentation, should always thank the audience. In a live presentation, that last speaker would also add, thank you for listening. We will now take questions from the audience, or do you have any questions for us? You would then wait a full minute because it takes the audience the full minute to come up with questions for you. So you don't leave the stage or the front of the room immediately, you wait. When you are recording, the last speaker should always thank your audience. When your recording has finished playing in class, a designated person will then ask your classmates, do you have any questions for us? We're happy to answer them now. At the end of your question period, you also take the time to thank your audience once again. I want to go into, that's overall the outline of a presentation. I want to go into using PowerPoints and other visual aids and thinking visually. So we should not see full sentences on your slides, and you should not be reading from your slides. I cannot tell you how boring it is to sit in the audience and read through the entire slide. Well, you probably know this from listening to all kinds of presentations this year, how boring it is to have read the entire slide and it is word for word the same as what the speaker is reading. Generally speaking, you've lost your audience before you get halfway through the first slide when you do that. So you want short bursts of text. You want graphics to try to hold the audience's attention. They should be relevant graphics. So if you are working on a project to let international students know more about resources for them at York, you can show photographs of international students at York. There is an international students organization that does have photographs, and you would just need to credit them. Okay, so you can incorporate audio clips and video clips into your presentation, being mindful of the time that they will take, but you need to test them on a PC because Mac files don't always work if someone is running them on a PC. The classrooms at York all contain PCs as far as I am aware. So if you are doing live presentations in them, please take note of this particular point. There are PC labs and there are Mac labs at York. If you're uncertain whether something is going to work, then you test it on both. These days, PowerPoint gives us incredibly tiny fonts. There's a difference between presenting on Zoom, as I am now, and presenting in a large hall where you're using Prezi or PowerPoint. You have to remember the size of the space that you're in, and you have to aim for the back of the space if you're in a physical space. So if you can check it out ahead of time, that's great. If you can't, use a minimum of 20-point fonts. Do keep your background plain so that you don't distract us. I find Prezi is incredibly bad for that. It is continually trying to distract us. And I know a few people it's made dizzy because of the directions it takes. So Prezi is good for a younger audience. I would say for an older audience, try to keep the background plain, try to keep the graphics relevant. And keep in mind that when PowerPoint first came out many years ago, every time it added a bell or a whistle, people would leap in to use them. So you often got animations where no animations were necessary. GIFs are distracting, especially if they're on a screen for a long time. So be very careful about what you're doing for your audience. Once again, no important points on the bottom quarter of the screen. I will repeat again, think visually. But the second thing I will add is one of the common things that I have seen that takes up time in presentations is when a team or an individual presents an incredibly good visual and takes the time to explain it, or sometimes not, but takes the time to explain it. And then the next thing that happens is the very next slide, they try to explain it textually. If you've got a good graphic, such as a chart or a pie graph of a statistic or of survey data or something of that nature, then you explain it while you're showing the chart or the visual. You do not show the visual and then show the text and explain it twice. That can be hard to do. It means you need to have good notes for the visual, and you need to design the visual so that there's a logical story being told by it that is easy for you to tell. Visuals acts as memory aids, and they're especially important in extemporaneous presentations where you're not allowed to read. I will emphasize again, with the exception of your objective, you should not be including full sentences on your slides. You should be including a hierarchy of bullet points where you're using text. Like I have on this slide, you should also be giving us sufficient detail. You don't use words like some or many in a report or a presentation. You use specific statistics like 70%. Some disciplines call for extemporaneous presentations, which means you can have notes or sometimes not, like engineering, you're not allowed to have notes. Your slides become your memory cue. That's part of the reason why they're so important. Because you're recording your presentation, you can of course write a script. However, at some point in your lives, you will be called upon to do live, and you will be told that you can't read. Your slides really do become your notes. When it comes to slide design, the team should decide upfront and ahead of time on the style and layout, the template that you're going to use. But within that, each team member should be creating their own individual part. So it's like your report, no one person should do the whole thing. Edgar, I see you have a question in here about how does that work? Can you expand on that, please?
Oh, yeah, just the engineering and the not leaving notes. I was just curious.
Oh, well, I've had to do it on many an occasion. Essentially, you design your slides so well that you create a coherent story. You end up rehearsing at least 3 or 4 times so that you have the points in your head, but you can be flexible with your wording. And what ends up happening, if you know your material really well and you've designed your slides well, is you give an incredibly dynamic presentation. In certain fields like mathematics and engineering, live is the only way to go. You cannot read a script. So it takes practice, and it can be nerve-wracking, but it's also really exciting when you do it. So because I work in multiple fields, I have to do both kinds.
I see.
Yeah. So it's essentially a case of you begin with design, you rework the slides wherever you stumble, because often it's the slide design that's making you stumble. The visuals really help because each one of them is designed to tell its own story. And then you know the storyline, it's the rehearsals that makes it good. Okay, so slide design for a team. If you must, and also if you're writing scripts or you're planning on presenting individually, whatever method you choose, you have to make sure that every team member uses our and we, not mine and I, because you're trying to give the impression of a team here. So it's our team or team indecision, as one of the teams in my tutorial is called, not here's the research that I did. Here's my conclusion. It is team indecision researched. One of the conclusions we came to is, as I've already said, design on a template, design as a team. Each person does their individual part, and you then do a team edit on the flow, the organization, and the content before anyone records. You're striving for smoothness and coherence and an overall sound story. You do a team edit for vocabulary on the slides. You also look for things like outliers in fonts and so on and so forth, text sizes and style. Acting as a team, whether your presentation is live or recorded, generally speaking, the person giving the introduction also introduces the team members. I've given you 2 strategies for doing that. Welcome to Team WRIT 103's presentation. My name is Andrea McKenzie, and our team is working on commuting to York, blah, 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 blah. My teammates are, and you simply introduce your teammates and you make sure that their photograph shows up on the recorded screen or live, that each team member raises a hand or smiles when their name is called. The other way is to do an overview of the presentation right up front in the introduction, which is thank you for attending or welcome. Welcome to Team such and such's presentation we're working on. I'm Andrea, and I'll be introducing our project. Janet will then discuss Y, followed by Ksenia, who will discuss A. Alyssa will discuss Z, Rositza will discuss A, and I'll then return to give our conclusions and recommendations. If you decide on example 2, you have to make this part really swift so that the introductions are done, but they don't take up much time. The second thing you can do, whether you're recording or whether you are doing live, is transitions, verbal transitions among speakers. So speaker 1 does not just end and there's a blank space and speaker 2 arrives and we don't know who they are. So speaker 1 can end their part with, and now Ksenia will discuss XXX. Ksenia, in her recorded part right at the beginning, then says, thanks, Andrea, and goes on to her topic. The other warning I would give you is not to be jack in the boxes. I have seen live presentations before where in a 15-minute presentation, there were 5 team members, and the longest anybody spoke for at one time was 1 minute. So the speakers were constantly changing, and we were constantly distracted by the change in speaker. So generally speaking, you have each person speak only once, except for the person doing the introduction and the conclusion or recommendation. Etter, in answer to your question, in that field, every presentation is unique and different. Yes, as a matter of fact, they are. Presentations are uniquely designed, and even if you present the same thing twice, you may use slightly different wording. During the question period, because you are going to be in your tutorials and you will be in a virtual space, the most efficient way to deal with the question period that will follow the playing of your recorded presentation is for all members of the team to raise their virtual hands. There are 2 ways to deal with questions, whether you're virtual or whether you're live. The first one is simply, you know what each person's special aspect of your topic is, and so you simply let people ask questions and let a particular team member answer that question because it's their area of expertise. The second way to do it is to choose one person to direct questions to the appropriate team member. Please note that there is a tendency in all presentations for audience members to direct all of the questions to the last person who spoke or who answered a question, and all team members must be aware that these questions should be redirected to the person with the most expertise in that area. That is, just because a question is directed specifically to you, you do not try and answer it. You tactfully pass it on to the right team member, and part of the director's job, if you have a director, is to field those questions and send them to the right place so that everyone has a chance to answer. And I've given you some suggestions, things like perhaps you could add to that, Andrea, or I think that's Janet's field rather than mine. Janet, would you like to answer that? There's also someone who asks a question, and someone usually does, that's outside the scope of your project. You can tell them that. You can simply say that wasn't part of our project, but if you do have a relatively reasonable answer for it, you can say we expect that given our own findings, you know, the answer to the question would be such and such. There are times and places where you simply don't know the answer, whether you're an individual or whether you're an individual or on a team. There will be times when you simply don't know the answer because you didn't do research in that area. Instead of just saying, well, I don't know, and leaving it at that, handle it tactfully. My stock response is that's a valuable question. We don't have an answer for it now, but you can be sure that I'll find out or will find out if it's a team before we take this project further. Ksenia, this is a case of the team is going to run the recording and then there will be a Q&A session. Their classmates will be asking the questions. So it's not going to be the team members raising the questions. It's going to be their classmates. I will ask all classmates to participate in this exercise. Do not tune out, really listen to the presentations, jot questions down as they go and ask them. Professional behavior. It is rare, but it does happen that I have seen teams dissolve into anger when they're actually presenting. It doesn't happen often, but I have seen it occasionally. Please keep in mind your presentation is virtual and recorded, so we would expect to see courtesy and politeness throughout it. In-person presentations can indeed be riskier. I remember one team presentation where the power went out in the middle of the team presentation. The dean of the faculty happened to drop in at the presentation that day. So there was the dean of the faculty, the director of first-year studies, a few faculty members, and right in the middle of a team presentation, the power went out, which meant computers went out, no slides, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think the team did? Any thoughts? What would you do in that situation? Yeah, Janet, they carried on. They simply said, they simply looked in the hallway, discovered that everything was off and said, we apologize for the disruption. We wish we could show you our slides, but we are going to carry on. And they did. They did an excellent presentation. They described their visuals. I mean, the audience couldn't see the visuals. They described the visuals on screen and they simply carried on. Regardless of crises that happen and regardless of, in fact, who caused them, you don't point fingers during a team presentation. What we see up there, what your internal feelings are, convey themselves to your audience. And I have seen this happen over and over and over again. So what you do ahead of time is you make backups and you plan for equipment failure. What is the team going to do if you have presentations on flash drives, you have them backed up online? You test all components on PCs and Macs if you're unsure of what equipment you'll be doing on, or you'll be presenting on, and you plan what to do if anything fails on the day. So it has happened before that the team member, the sole team member, which I never think is a good idea, brought the wrong copy of the presentation on a flash drive. Team members can respond in multiple ways to this circumstance. They can say, it's okay, we'll deal with this. We all know the second last version, so don't worry about it. Let's just go do the best presentation we can. They can also respond to it by saying, you stupid idiot, much like that reviewer did on my file. by showing anger and showing blame. If that occurs, the team will walk out and will convey all that upset, etc. Not to mention the person who feels responsible for causing what the team has very clearly perceived as a problem is going to feel worse and probably do a worse job. You always support your team. Like and dislike do not matter. It's not what happens to you. You are judged on how you deal with it. Remember that team who had to present in a blackout. They couldn't even see one another because it was an internal room. Part of behaving in a team. If you're in a live presentation, you show yourself as attentive while others are talking. You are not checking your own notes while a team member is presenting. You also show it through shared question answering. Yeah, Janet, you carried on for your lecture. Edgar, you cry after the presentation, as it was that poor team that carried on so bravely. They got commended by the dean, who made special comments at the end of their presentation. And yes, it is a good idea to have a printed copy of your PowerPoint presentation. So now I'm speaking to individual team members. You rehearse individually before you show up at a team presentation so that you know your part. You need to rehearse out loud. It doesn't matter whether you are reading a script or you're doing an extemporaneous presentation. If you do not read out loud or speak out loud, as I am doing now, there is some kind of disconnect. Even muttering doesn't necessarily work. You speak out loud, you emulate the circumstances as much as possible, which means either sitting or standing, depending on your preferences, looking at the audience as though they're there and presenting to them. But you must do it out loud because somehow that engraves the words on your brain. I would also point out that if you're reading a script, you have to practice to make it sound as dynamic and alive as though you're not reading. And I can tell you from experience, that's incredibly hard to do. I used to do radio, very small time, and hung around with radio types who gave me all kinds of suggestions for doing that. The best I can tell you is to put as much life into your voice when you're reading as possible. Do not be like my friend, the dental surgeon who does lectures for another university. He put himself to sleep while he was recording his lecture because he was reading and it was boring. You can try speaking extemporaneously from notes because it invariably sounds better, but you don't have to. You are allowed to use a script for this. When you rehearse, go right through from the beginning to the ending 3 or 4 times before you record or before you join the team presentation. It's very important that if you're speaking extemporaneously, so you're not reading from a script, and you stumble twice on the same slide, probably your design slide is at fault. You need to redesign that slide. You also need to time yourself. It's only fair to your team members that you time yourself rehearsing and you cut down your section to meet the time limits. When you do get together as a team to record, you know, you can record individually and splice them all together, or you can try recording all together as a team. Whatever you do, you need to review and revise the team slides before you record the presentation to make sure that you have flow and coherence. You can also edit your team's video, but before you cut any individual members or edit any individual members section, you need that member's agreement to do so, and the whole team should agree about any cuts. When you rehearse, obviously you are a team. You want to bolster your teammates' confidence, and so you comment on strengths where you think a change needs to be made. You are tactful and you are diplomatic. Every team must edit to cut the presentation if it runs over time, but you must not cut any member down to under 3 minutes. Emphasize once again, use accessible software. I've already gone over this. You can prepare the entire team slides and record everyone together, or you can do it individually. Emphasis once again, every individual member has independent choice about whether or not to turn the camera on. Individual members have to rehearse, time themselves, and ensure that their part is 3 minutes. And team members should make those verbal transitions to be prepared to revise. Very briefly, look up how to record on PowerPoint. You can record individual slides, and if one slide isn't satisfactory, you can erase and do it over again. To do it, you just open your slide deck like this one. I think I have a slide of this anyway, but you click on record. In the top menu bar, you should be able to see it. It's right here. You click on record. You can record from the beginning or from the current slide. If I click on from current slide, I see this. I cannot turn my camera on because Zoom's already using it, but essentially across the top, what you see is the timer. You see the record button. When you hit this, it will count down 3, 2, 1, and then it will begin recording. You see the camera, you can turn it on or off. You see the microphone, you have to make sure it's on. You can add notes to your slide. And what you actually will see is the slide that you're on. You will see the slide number. The one important thing I want to point out is if you go to the 3 dots, I haven't recorded anything on this slide, but you will see clear recordings here on current slide or on all slides. So if you record a slide and you're not happy with it, you can simply clear the recording for that slide only and start over again. So there's the important part. I have shown it in the recording. Just going to go back to slideshow so that it shows up in the recording. There are the important parts. If you turn the camera on, you will have your little Zoom box. I would point out what you can do once you finish recording. Sometimes that box overrides the text on the screen. You can click on the box and you can make it larger or smaller, or you can move it around on the screen. Creating an MP4 file when you're finished. I want to go through this so it's on the recording. When you click on file in the top menu, you don't click on save or save as, you click on export, and you then click on create a video. Going to emphasize we're not after high definition video for this. 720 is fine. It will take less time to render and less time to upload. Once you've chosen the resolution, you click on create video and you choose where to save the MP4 file. You then have to wait for however long the video is going to take to render, which in some cases can be a long time depending on length and depending on resolution. You have to leave PowerPoint open. After the slides have finished rendering as an MP4, there's a status bar at the bottom. You then make sure that you save your PowerPoint file as well. Couple of tips for speaking in person. It is fairly simple. If you remember, we need to hear you, understand you, not be distracted by mannerisms. We need to see you look at us because that shows interest. So the translation of that is speak clearly at a natural pace and develop your own style, even though you need to practice expression and pace to do that. Always stand straight or sit straight. Try to look tall and confident, and you deliver to your audience, which in my case is a camera right now. When you're in a room with live people, you deliver to them. You do not deliver to your paper. You do not deliver to the screen. Looking at your audience assures them you're paying attention to them. And you have to remember, even if you are prone to nervousness, that looking at them shows your interest in the topic. And if you look up and out, then your voice will travel to them naturally, even if you have a microphone. You also need to think about yourself and what you're comfortable with. You don't want to force an alien style on yourself. You want to develop something you really are comfortable with. And you consider your capabilities, familiarity with equipment, but experiment. And you always dress for confidence and comfort and in what's appropriate for the audience that you're speaking to. Managing nerves. I admit, the very first year I had to lecture, when I first began doing that, I had to lecture to 100 people twice a day. And I was so nervous that my assistant practically had to push me out on the stage to do it. I am still nervous when I'm speaking in a new space. Here are my tips for you. Begin when you're ready. Don't rush. Until you're ready to begin, you keep your eyes down. When you are ready to begin, you look up, you look at the audience, you look around, and remarkably, they will quiet down as soon as they see you do that. At that point, you take a deep breath and you begin. And if you're not sure how to begin, you do the simple thing. You say good morning or good afternoon and welcome to my presentation about, and you state your topic. You end strongly and smoothly by saying, that concludes my presentation and thank you. That beginning, that set beginning and that ending makes you look strong. You give the appearance of confidence. Don't speak about nerves. Don't apologize too much. If you don't have notes and you forget what you're going to say, you simply pause naturally, take a deep breath, focus, look at your slides, focus, plan your first couple of words, and begin again. I guarantee the audience won't even notice that you stopped because pausing is natural in a presentation. Second thing is to learn your weaknesses and strategize. I start to shake all over, including my voice, about 30 seconds into any live presentation. My strategy for that is to give my opening, put up a visual, tell the audience, look at this. It's either a quote or a visual of some kind. And I then have the opportunity to breathe and bring myself back into control. If you shake at the knees, wear baggy trousers or a long skirt, whatever your preference is. Next, focus on the audience, which may be surprising advice, not on yourself. You have an exciting topic, you've done the research, you want to tell them about it. You know your subject, you have practiced, you are good. And always keep in mind, your audience cannot see your knees knocking together, won't notice your hands are shaky, and won't notice you skipped a line. I also have to say, people tend to focus on one single presentation and cringe about it. Keep in mind that you're your own worst critic, especially for live presentations. Don't do that to yourself. Focus on your strengths. Reflect about what you can learn from this presentation. Think that 3 minutes won't matter in 10 years' time, and that each one of us improves with practice. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. Class is now officially over, so you are free to leave. Anyone with questions, of course, can stay. Thank you once again. And have a great week, a lovely day. Please do get out in the sunshine if it's possible for you to do it.
Thank you again for letting us do the survey during class.